Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we're in our 22nd year, I interview writers about their craft, what they've done in the past, what they're working on, what they might have planned for the future. We also occasionally interview other brands of artists. We've had on musicians, we've had on actors, we've had on painters and other forms of artists. It's a pretty wide net. So if you have an idea for someone who might be right for the writer's block, whether a poet or journalist or novelist or another kind of artist, please watch for our address at the end of the show. There's another address I'd like you to watch for the URL address, theyatesgame.org, for information about the play that began in Gloucester here in the West End Theater. The Yates Game later moved to Boston and will be in New York in February of 2012. That's theyatesgame.org, and that'll appear on the screen later. I'm very happy this evening, to welcome John Morris to the show, who was very good enough to drive in from Tyngsboro for this interview to talk about his wonderful book, Alone at Sea. I'm going to read for his introduction a bit of information from the book jacket of Alone at Sea. John Morris, who is a PhD, is the grandson of one of the last Gloucester dorymen lost at sea. And this book starts out with that very touching story about his grandfather. A native of Gloucester himself, John is descended from a line of fishermen going back to the 17th century. His father was a fish cutter, his mother a fish packer. Director Emeritus of the Institute for Aging Research at Hebrew Senior Life in Boston, a Harvard-affiliated hospital and research program, John is published widely in his field. He is a board member of the group preserving one of the last surviving Gloucester schooners, Adventure. He now lives in Tyngsboro, Mass., and as I mentioned, he drove all the way out here. It's an hour drive, he told me before the show, from Tyngsboro, and I really, really appreciate that. Welcome to the Writer's Block, John.
Thank you, John. Just glad to be here.
I want to show the book, first of all. This is a very handsome book. It's very, very well written and well researched. Also, it is handsome. It's a good-looking book with a lot of good graphic work, and it starts with the cover, and through the show we'll show some of the pictures on the inside of the book. The book, again, is Alone at Sea, Gloucester in the Age of the Doryman, 1623, 1939. And this is nothing less than a really complete history of Gloucester at sea in those years.
That was the goal. I started with a grandfather and ended up writing a complete history of this fishery.
Tell us about your grandfather and how his career went and how, tragically it ended.
Yeah, he came from a small island in Sweden called Gullholmen. And he came over in 1893 with 5 other young men from Gullholmen. Fisheries were not doing too well on their little island. That's all they did was fish. And so in his early 20s, he came here and fished in Gloucester from 1893 to 1935. And what he was most of the time in that whole time was a long-line doryman going out after halibut. He would be gone typically for 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. My mom, my aunts, my uncle would say, he'd get back, it'd be like Christmas, 2 or 3 days, and then he's gone for another month. That was the life that they led their whole childhood. In 35, he drowned. He was one of the last dorymen to drown. He and his dory mate were on St. Peter's Bank, which is south of Newfoundland, and either a rogue wave or one of them had a problem. Nobody ever saw all that was recovered from the 2 men caught in one of the fish hooks on the long dory line, on the long ground line, was my grandfather's mitt. Everything else, nothing else recovered. Captain Carl Olson of the Earthfjord spinner went around for 2 days looking for them, but they never found anything.
And was there fog at that time?
Well, it had been after a very rough winter, very high winds, and a big high was now coming in up the East Coast, coming up onto that ground. So there were big waves. The men didn't think they were too big to fish. It was right on the margin of what would be acceptable. And if you're a dory fisherman, you've got to keep your head into that dory into the wind. You've got to watch carefully. Something might have happened. They might not have kept their head into the wind. Who knows? All we know is that the two men were lost. One of them, a man named Charles Daly, had once been a skipper. He was in his early 50s. My grandfather was in his early 60s. Neither of them ever saw any of their children married. My grandfather had 5 children, would have had 9 grandchildren, 5 children, 9 grandchildren. Daly had 9 children. He would have ended up with 48 grandchildren. He never saw one of them. Very nice family, and I've, of course, made contact with them, and they're described in the book.
Was there then, would you say, as there is sometimes today, pressure against safety because of economic
This is the end
motives?
of this is the end of the dory area, and there are in 1935, in the middle of the Depression, 6 to 9 Gloucester schooners that are still going out after halibut and dory fishing. There aren't many dory vessels left.
There had been hundreds.
There had been hundreds. There've been over 500 if you go back to the 1870s. I don't think pressure is it. I think they had a very great captain in Carl Olson. The crew would have been a very seasoned crew. They would have gone to sea together for a number of years. These men didn't take chances. It was just the fluke.
I'm curious how your grandfather found Gloucester when he migrated over here.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting story. The fisheries in the west coast of Sweden, herring-based, had been in decline for much of the 19th century. And Gloucester was sending, of all things, herring to Sweden. And we sent over a brand new schooner with Sweden to the big west coast city, Göteborg. And my grandfather and others heard about it. And they said, Gloucester, America, lots of vessels, opportunity to make a living. Within a decade, about 25 or 30 people from Gilhoman came here out of a population of over 2.25. So a lot of people migrated here. We had a lot of migrations like this, with the Nova Scotians, the Newfoundland, the Portuguese, the Italians. They all follow this sort of model. Come here. This became known as a place where you could make a living.
And did they come into Boston or going to New York?
My grandfather came through New York. They took a train to Boston, took a train from Boston to Gloucester. When he got here, about a decade earlier, several people from that same island named Lunds, distant cousins, were already here. And they went into the Lunds boarding house. The Lunds got them a berth right away on one of these halibuters, and they then went to Newfoundland, not to Newfoundland, to Iceland. And he would have spent from March to September fishing off of Iceland.
So your family kind of encompasses a classic American story, the immigration to the United States, and his grandson, you, went to Gloucester High and then on to Boston University and Brandeis and PhD, and writing books about him. It's a wonderful.
It's a wonderful story. I got to love the man as a child. I have his sketches that he did in the early part of the 20th century of vessels and scenes, etc. And my mom has always felt very close to her father, so I always heard very positive things about him, about a lot of these men. These were very interesting men.
You missed him by
5 years.
5 years.
5 to 6 years, yeah. He drowned at 35. I was born in 41, so we never got to meet. But I feel like I know him.
I started to get a sense that I knew him a little bit after reading about him and the dory fishing, which I've known about it a little bit, and also the boat he was on, the Spinney. Can you tell us when you thought of writing this book and kind of the evolution? Because it's a very impressive book, a lot of research, a lot of fact finding, and a lot of writing and rewriting, and then you had to put the graphics together, etc. How long a process was that?
It took me 10 years to do the research and write the book. It all began very interestingly when there was a website maintained by a dear woman in Gloucester who since died named Roberta Sheedy. And she had all of this information about Gloucester fisheries. She would abstract material from the local papers, answer questions. And one of the things was about the vessel he drowned on, the Erythrea F. Spinney. And the grandson of the skipper of the Spinney had a little note on the website. And he said, I'll gladly answer any questions. So, I said, well, I'm interested. I email him, and he emails me back the following. He said, my name is Steve Olson. I am named after your grandfather. My father, who went to sea as a child with him, said he was the best man he ever knew in his life. My father went on to become the president of 2 American universities. He said, so yes, we feel very close to your grandfather. Well,
What a
I had
wonderful surprise, huh?
Yeah, well, I'd heard all these stories about my grandfather. Here now I had confirmation, pretty decent confirmation, that he was a special man and that it was worth beginning this sort of adventure of putting this history together. It hadn't been done. I spoke to Joe Garland, I spoke to others. Nobody had done this. And so I said, all right, I've got enough connection to this history to put the commitment in to make it happen.
And so what year did you begin the book?
About 14 years ago now.
And I want to make sure our audience knows where they can get Alone at Sea. Is this available on?
You can get it in the local bookstores. You can get it on, you can get it on Amazon.
Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
Yeah. So you can get it. This is the hardcover. This is the end of this run of it. The soft cover will come out in the spring, but the still hardcover readily available for anybody who wants to see it.
Great
Good copy.
Christmas present.
I think so.
And the soft cover is coming out in
In
the
the
spring of
spring.
2012.
Yeah. Right.
We talked before the show started about a passage
Yeah.
that perhaps you can read about a rescue for which a certain party was given a lot of medals.
He was.
And-
The rescue was by the man who was the skipper of the vessel when my grandfather drowned. He's a Norwegian. He came into this country by jumping ship in Canada and walking across the border. And he became one of our greatest skippers. Gordon Thomas, in his book, Fast and Able, acknowledges that. Everything I saw acknowledged it. He and a guy named Archie McLeod from the end of the 20s through the 30s are the 2 great halibut skippers who are competing. They get out first, they stay longest, they bring in the biggest catch, they make the most money for the men.
And he jumped ship
Jump ship,
and then into Canada and then walked south.
walked across the border. I probably thought nobody would ever catch him, and nobody ever did. And it was easy in those days to become an American citizen. You basically went to sea on one of these vessels, and the laws were different. Very quickly could become a
They'd have
citizen.
trouble walking across the border today, I think.
Yeah, well, let's hope so, given all that's happened. So what's going on now is they're out fishing, and and when you go out fishing on a schooner, what literally happens, they would have like 12 double-man dories, so there'd be 26 men on the boat. And the skipper would, one after another, at a half a mile distance, as he's going across the fishing grounds, let each dory out. And then they would go like a mile to lay ground trawl with all their fishing hooks in the bottom of the sea. The last dory now has this man in it, Chris Nielsen. Chris is in his mid-50s. And Chris Nielsen is like a father to Carl Olson. He lived with the man for part of his early years in Gloucester. And so all that's left on the vessel as they're going with the wind across the fishing ground are the cook and the skipper and the men in this dory. So one of the Olson's doryman, Chris Nielsen, lost his footing when the dory was being lowered on a flying set. And Captain Olson, fully clothed, dove into the windswept sea to save him. The sea was rough, and Nielsen and his mate had been about to set the last dory to be put over the side. Only Captain Olson was on the deck as Nielsen went overboard. All the other dories had been launched and were spreading out across the open sea. Nielsen and his doryman, Johnson, had hoisted the dory clear of the rail, and the accident happened as they were lowering into the sea. Nielsen was aft, holding the rope looped through the stern, keeping the stern tackle from slipping off. Johnson was forward, holding the painter. As the dory hung over the side, a wave struck the schooner. Water rushed upward and struck the descending dory. The bow tackle let loose, and the dory was wrenched from Nielsen's grasp as he stood with one foot on the schooner and one in the dory. In that instant, he was hurled into the water, loaded down with his gear, oilskins, hip-high rubber boots. Captain Olson was at the wheel, thinking of how he and the cook would go after a suet fish or two when the dories were all away. But as he saw Nielsen disappear, he yelled to the cook, "Come up and bring her about. I've got to get Chris." In the blink of an eye, Olsen dove into the frigid sea, hitting the water an instant after Nielsen, bobbing to the surface. When the cook reached the deck, Olsen was nowhere to be seen. What the story then goes on, it's very interesting. This vessel is making pretty decent speed. It's going to take a long time to come around. And Nielsen can't swim very well. The skipper can. The skipper gets to him in frigid water and tells him, basically, if you don't come back, I don't come back. He then sees some oars floating on the surface of ice. Says, "Hold on, Nick." And he swims to the oars, gets the oars, pushes them back, and the two men hold on to the oars until the vessel comes around and the other dorymen who had seen the commotion are able to come save him. Without that, this man is dead. This man has lost his life in his mid-50s. He's going to go on to live almost another 50 years, thanks to Captain Carl Olsen.
And
It's a great story.
Wonderful story. And this is not swimming pool atmosphere.
This is the heavy
this is
seas,
heavy seas, cold water.
Cold water. A man could die in 15 to 30 minutes. I have a great uncle who, off of Iceland, at the age of 23, died in less than a half an hour, even though he got back on top of the dory. He kept on getting washed off. You couldn't survive very long in this type of weather, in this type of water. It just didn't happen.
You mentioned early in the book, because your grandfather was on the Aretha Spinney, the schooner Spinney. And I want to make sure I touch on the history post-fishing of that boat. It's kind of an interesting,
And the year
glamorous fate there.
In the year that my grandfather drowned, MGM was going to make the movie Captain's Courageous with Spencer Tracy. He got an Academy Award for the movie.
This is 1935.
And the movie's made in 36. So at the end of 35, they're looking for a vessel to become the Werehair. And they purchase from Captain Olsen the Spinney. They do some shooting off here. They sail her over to the West Coast. They do more shooting of the movie. And so when you see that movie, old black and white movie, and you look on the deck, or you look in the forecastle, or you look in the captain's cabin, that's the Erythrea F. Spinney. That's the vessel my grandfather was on. That was Captain Carl Olsen's vessel, one of the last great Gloucester schooners.
Of the generation of Adventure, although
Right.
Adventure was made in
26.
26.
Yeah,
So it was a later boat and engine. I think
All of these
from
vessels
the
by
start,
then
from
had
the start.
Right. By the 30s, there's only a couple vessels, the Thomas Gordon, for example, that didn't have an engine, and they were only used for moving fish back from way far north, like Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, down to here. All the other vessels would have had engines in them. They would have been auxiliary engines to help. They would have also used their sails. They would have used their sails on the grounds, but they would have had a combination of both to go out.
I always ask writers, because we have some younger audience members watching, what advice you might give to somebody who's got an idea. Might have to do with Gloucester fishing. It might have to do with farming. It might have to do with IT research. Any subject. What should they do if they want to write a book?
I think you begin doing your research. You get your outline. It's like any other project. You have a conceptualization of where it's going. It took me almost 2 years to do that, because I started out writing a family history, then I realized, no, this was something very different.
So that's 2 years just sort of to define the ground rules to
To
yourself.
define the ground rules, to begin to do the research, to get a lay of the land, and to recognize that there was a big story to be told that hadn't been told before. And if you're going to do something, why retell a story? If Joe Garland had already written this book and it was laying there, I would have just read Joel's book and been very pleased to have read it. But that hadn't happened. It wasn't there. So I was trying to fit in my own interest into what was in the marketplace. Then the second piece of thing is begin to write and get good people to critique your writing, and write and rewrite and write and rewrite and then do it again. And don't be afraid of coming back 6 months later and throwing away half of what you wrote. This book I wrote twice as many words that are in this final manuscript, and that was okay, because as you go through the process, you get more and more committed to telling the story. Joe Gallen told me once, tell the story well. Tell it simply, tell it well. And I think that's what you do. And you get a lot of material that you've got to put together. But ultimately, there's a story. If there's a story to be told, figure out how to tell it in a way that somebody else would want to read it.
I like that advice. I hope our younger viewers hear that. Write something, write it again, write it again, write it again, and then after that, write it again.
Write it again. Yeah.
It
And just get good people to help you edit and read it as you go forward. I mean, that's a great advice, too.
This started out as simply a history of your family that you were going to write for your family?
For me, if you write, I'm a long-term researcher. Everything I do, if I don't love it myself, why am I doing it? So the first reason I was doing it is I wanted to know the story. I wanted to understand the story. And then I said, all right, I can write the story for my family. And then very quickly, my wife and I started to talk, and we said, no, that's not what you're going to put years of your life into doing. You're going to put years of your life into doing something quite different. And as a part of doing this, I went to libraries all over the place. I tried to go to all the places they fished out. I went to Nova Scotia. I went to Newfoundland. I went to Iceland. I went to Sweden. You know, I've been to a lot of these places just to get a flavor and to talk to some of the people that are still alive that I could have conversations with.
It's a wonderful book, and I wanted to mention, which I didn't earlier, that this was named for special recognition at the 8th Annual Gloucester Preservation Awards ceremony in May of 2011. And I promised our audience, and then kind of neglected, to say I would show some of the graphics and some of the black and white photography that runs beautifully throughout the book. Now, I'm not sure how much detail we can see. I'm going to hold up Men of the Schooner Sylvania with Captain Jeff Thomas on the right. Jeff Thomas is prominent in the history of the adventure as well.
He is. He of course, the commissioned adventure, the Thomases become one of the things I tried to do in writing the book was take exemplary people who came from different areas of the world. Nova Scotia sent us a lot of the fishermen, and the Thomas brothers become the ones that I focus on from Nova Scotia. And so, reading the book, you're going to get to know Captain Jeff. From his coming here to dying on board the deck of the schooner Adventure as he's chopping ice when he shouldn't have been in his early 60s.
Here is Captains Jeff Thomas and Ben Pine, again, with other master mariners dressed up about 1930. A wonderful old picture of these seafaring gentlemen in their Sunday best.
Yeah. One of the things we tried to do in the book was select pictures, and the Cape Ann Museum was very helpful, select pictures that had not shown up in other books. So when you pick this up, you got, even if you knew about this material, you would say, oh, I never saw that. That's interesting.
I'll show one more picture. I just got from Alexis a 4-minute signal.
Okay.
So this is a picture of a halibut offloaded in 1921, and I don't need to say anything more. All I have to do is hold it up. That is an impressive halibut.
Yeah, it's amazing to think we once had those off of our shores, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Maybe someday again.
Maybe someday, but that's about as big as they got, and it's a very impressive picture.
The book is chock full of wonderful black and white pictures from the era, and I want to strongly recommend this book to our audience. John Morris, thanks very much for coming down to be on the writer's block.
John, thank you for having me.
Tingsboro is more than I shout away, and I appreciate you driving in for this. I want to urge everybody to look at Alone at the Sea and think about Gloucester history, and as you page through this, and maybe with Christmas coming up, I don't want to sell something, just offhand, but that's a thought for you. If you've learned something about John Morris's wonderful book, Alone at Sea, here on the Writer's Block, then tonight we've done our job. I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.